So welcome to Allyship 101. I'm going to just start by introducing myself. This is me. I'm Roxanne. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a resident life area coordinator down at Utah Tech University in sunny St. George, Utah. So about 4 hours south of Salt Lake if you don't know where St. George is. And I'm also a justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion educator. I didn't put them in order, but if I had, it spells out the acronym JEDI. And so when I do these trainings with my RAs back home in St. George, I say, okay, how are we going to be Jedis today? And they roll their eyes because they don't think my references are funny, but that's okay. I'll live. So I want to start by just laying down what I hope that you'll take away from this session today. So, number one, I want you to be able to lead and be able to define the term microaggression. Now, everyone describes a microaggression as something different, but I want you to walk away with kind of your own definition of what you know that it is. Number two, I want you to be able to recognize a microaggression when it happens and articulate the ways in which it is harmful for that person and for our communities. And then last but not least, I want you to understand methods for interrupting microaggressions and marginalization through the use of microaffirmations and microinterventions. And you'll create a personalized plan for how you'll advocate for social safety on your campuses moving forward. Sound good? We're gonna do a lot of learning, so it's gonna be great. I created this Allyship 101 curriculum probably about 2 years ago now. And it was in direct response to some anti-Semitic comments that I was the target of in my own department at Utah Tech. It was really hard for me, and I thought that, oh, I'm in higher ed, it's this blue liberal bubble, even if I am in a red state, but I was still becoming the target of a microaggression pretty regularly, and I was over it. And so myself along with a coworker decided to create Allyship 101 for a staff development day on campus. And then after I gave the presentation, more and more people on campus were reaching out to me and saying, come to our trainings, come to our meetings. We want you to talk about this. And so I found that going back to the basics, even for myself, was super helpful because nobody can be an expert in JEDI, right? It's a continuous learning curve and we're all learning together. So there are two components to Allyship 101, and we're going to go over both of these today. So the first is your understanding and your spotting microaggressions when they happen. And the second is learning how/when to interrupt these microaggressions and how to increase social safety. Social safety, which we'll talk more about later in the presentation, was a component I added specifically for this presentation because I started to dig into more research that was published in 2022, actually pretty recently, that talked about how social safety was an integral component to combating microaggressions on college campuses and improving overall health. So I also wrote this quote at the bottom. I think sometimes people say, I'm an ally to this community. We can't be perfect all the time. So it's impossible to be 100% an ally to that community if you don't hold those identities. So I like to move towards the language of, I practice acts of allyship, because this is an active term that you can use, so we're not like, oh, I'm an ally, so I'm done learning, right? We want to continuously practice acts of allyship so we can continuously become better for ourselves and better for our campus communities. Awesome. So, can anyone give us a definition of a microaggression?
I think like passive comments that are like passive-aggressive comments or passive-aggressive comments.
Perfect, thank you. Passive-aggressive comments. Would anyone like to add on to that? Yes.
I think of them as like harmful comments that aren't like outright violence, but they are harmful. They're like indirectly harmful, or they don't like, it's like a subtle way to be aggressive.
Indirect and subtle comments. Yes, thank you. Anyone? Yeah.
And just piggybacking, like, directed to a specific group.
Exactly. Right, directed towards a specific community. Absolutely. Is that a hand?
Yeah. Similar to what everyone else is saying. The way I see it as well is, actions or even words that kind of target someone's identity in a negative way.
Mm-hmm. Right. It's usually identity focused, right? A bias maybe towards a certain identity or based on a stereotype that you hold. Yeah. Did I say it?
Yeah,
you want to read it? Stereotype.
Yeah, the stereotypes, the assumptions about a group
exactly. So I'm gonna put the definition that I have up here, and it's a little bit longer, and I'll read it. But first I wanna say that microaggressions are a form of meta-communication, right? They're communicating something, but the meaning behind them is probably different, and that is the harmful piece of it. So let me read this. Most microaggressions are subtle and indirect, but they occur frequently in daily interactions of members of historically underrepresented groups. And most often, people who commit microaggressions think of themselves as well-intentioned people. They do not realize that the underlying messages communicated by their actions or comments are hurtful to other people. So that's where that meta-communication comes in. Before we move on, does anybody have any questions about the definition of a microaggression? We're going to go over some examples, but I want to check in. Yes?
So that's when they're not intending to be rude? Like, if someone is saying a comment like that and they do mean to, they do mean to be rude a little bit, is that not a microaggression? Is that just passive aggression?
So that's a great question. So it could be what we call a macroaggression, where it's blatant, it's violent, it's meant to be aggressive. But there also, in your packet, there's, I think the first one is called a microassault. And that also is similar in nature. It tends to be more violent and blatant and intentional. So thank you for asking that question. Awesome. So I wanted to gear this towards the departments that we all work in. Hopefully you're all here if you work in housing or residence life, or you're just here for fun. And these are some common microaggressions that I have witnessed or observed or heard from students that have happened in the building where I work. So I'm just gonna read through them starting in the top left-hand corner. Mispronouncing residents' names, referring to residents by the wrong gender pronouns, telling or laughing at sexist or racist jokes, improperly addressing messages consisting of slurs and or harmful drawings such as swastikas. That one happened at my undergrad while I was there. Assuming that a resident/prospective resident would like a certain room placement based on their gender/sexual identity. Assuming that a resident lives in a certain room placement based on their gender and sexual identity. Making unsolicited comments on someone's hair products, or wigs. Making unsolicited comments on the smell of someone's cooking. Denying the experiences of residents we have historically and systematically marginalized and silenced by questioning the credibility/validity of their stories. You'll recognize what I have in parentheses there. I think that sometimes when we say marginalization, they're not marginalizing themselves. Like, we as part of marginalized communities aren't marginalizing ourselves. The power systems at play are the ones doing the marginalization. So just keep that in mind when I say that for now. And then quote unquote randomly grouping for room assignment individuals based on their skin color, ethnicity, or international student status when it's not specifically requested as part of a roommate assignment or part of like a living learning community situation. So these are some common aggressions in residence life. So I want to hear from you all. Let's talk about what student populations you might be interacting with on any given day. Yes?
There is a Indigenous Peoples Living Learning community in my building, and so I have a large group, one of the largest groups on campus, that are specifically choosing to have in that house.
Awesome. Right, so we're engaging with Indigenous populations of students. Awesome, thank you. Yes?
My community hosts a large percentage of international students.
International students, absolutely.
Neurodivergent students.
Neurodivergent students, absolutely. Students with disabilities. Awesome. Yeah, absolutely. LGBTQ in the back.
That's what I was gonna say.
Okay, awesome. Yes.
Socioeconomic status.
Absolutely. Socioeconomic status, class, where they're coming from. Others.
Non-male identifying.
Non-male identifying, absolutely. Non-binary, genderqueer, women, absolutely. Yes.
Athletes, I know athletes in big groups together.
Right, student athletes. How do we see them outside of that identity of just being a student athlete? How do we not group them all together based on that identity? Thanks for bringing that up, yeah. Others. I brought my list too, so I'll read you my list. LGBTQ, students of color, disabled students, international students, unauthorized/undocumented students, veteran students, students who are over the age of 25, students of non-Christian religions, that's an important one for us down in St. George, first-generation students, both to college and in the US, parental status, maybe they have kids, socioeconomic status, and students from large cities/students from rural cities, and talking about how their experiences compare. So you all called out a lot of those, thank you. So this is a new slide I added as well, and it's the why, right? We sit in this room and maybe we know why we're here, but maybe we don't. Maybe you've heard that when people use the term microaggressions, they describe it as death by 1,000 cuts. And that means that maybe it's the first time that you've used the incorrect gender pronouns for someone, that forever. Like maybe this is the first time you've ever misgendered that person. But it might be the 12th or 13th time that day that they have been misgendered by others in the community as well. So that repeated exposure to microaggressions based on that identity that they hold, we just used to think that it was emotionally and psychologically harmful, but the research that is coming out shows that it's also equally physically harmful. We're seeing increased rates of cardiovascular issues. We're seeing increased rates of inflammation in the body that leads to other causes of death. And inflammation-related deaths are actually the leading cause of death in the world, which people don't really know about because it causes so many other issues in the body. And so when people are operating under these circumstances, we call it the default state. So like me, I hold a marginalized identity. The one I'm speaking about specifically, that's pretty salient for me in St. George, is that I'm Jewish. And because I've been the target of anti-Semitic comments in my office, I am always in this default state of hypervigilance. I am monitoring myself and my behaviors and how I talk to others. And I'm other monitoring, which means I'm being really observant with what's going on around me, who I'm interacting with, what's going on in the spaces where I work and live. Safety maintenance strategies, maybe a student is avoiding certain places on campus, avoiding the housing office, avoiding their RA, and they remain in this state of hypervigilance, which is where we see those poor mental and physical health outcomes, that increased inflammation, things like that. And that increased default state tells our students it's not safe here, which is kind of counterintuitive to what we're doing in housing, right? I put home in big letters because that's what we're striving for in residence life. We want to create a home for our students, but if they're in this default hypervigilance state, they can never down-regulate their system, and they can never feel relaxed and truly at home. So it's our responsibility to help with this. So this slide I wanted to add in as well for this session because I get the quote from people when I give this trainings, I don't commit any of the microaggressions that you put on the slide or the ones in the packet. So I'm good, right? That's a great first step, right? A great first step is recognizing microaggressions, interrupting them, and not targeting someone in the first place. But the absence of microaggressions does not necessarily equal safety in a residential environment. So we, as housing professionals, as educators, bless you, we need to remove that uncertainty in that environment so they can down-regulate their systems, like I was talking about, and truly feeling comfortable in their space. So how do we do that? We do that through explicit indicators of social inclusion and protection. We'll elaborate on that in a second. And people, I was having a conversation, this is a side note, I was having a conversation with my dad the other day, and he told me that I was being overly sensitive, and I'm part of the snowflake generation. Anybody else heard this? Yeah, okay, right? So research also shows that when we create these instances of social safety, we're allowing for stress-related growth and resilience. And students will never build resilience unless we make this environment for them in the first place. So if I, were to give it to my dad, I'd be like, okay, yes, maybe I'm being oversensitive, but also I get to sometimes thrive in an environment that helps me grow under stress and creates resilience. So if I'm in a similar situation later, I might be able to process it in a more healthy way, knowing that I have a safe environment behind me and people to mentor me and people to support me. And then finally, I think we use the term support a lot in higher ed, right? How do we support students? Challenge, support, there's a third word, I feel like. But the research shows that maybe, especially in housing, we should be moving towards the word safety, right? How do we maximize safety? And how do we move from this support model to this social safety model? So, committing to act. I'll just flip my thing here. So how do we cultivate social safety in our communities? So the first is through microaffirmations. Has anybody heard of microaffirmations before? Besides in your packet. It's also in your packet. So through my research, I learned of the two terms microaffirmations and microinterventions. And those are two things that I use pretty regularly in my work because the term micro means small, right? These are small and simple things that we can incorporate into our daily routines that make a huge impact for our students. I think oftentimes maybe we don't know the impact of our work until a student says something or writes us a note or something telling us about how impactful we are on them. But we can do these small things and know that we are helping to make a difference. So again, I'll start from the top right or left-hand corner. These are things you can do to affirm your students. Correctly pronouncing residents' names. You can use the phrase, what would you like me to call you, or how would you like me to pronounce your name? Condemning mistreatment and discrimination of marginalized communities. Using correct gender pronouns, that's a huge one. Offering your own pronouns in a space. Maybe they don't ask for them. Maybe it's not explicitly, introduce your name and your pronouns, but you're offering them. Displaying pride flags, Black Lives Matter flags, or other identity flags in your office or office spaces. Displaying posters, books, or other indicators of safety. I was talking in the session about regarding autism yesterday, and we were talking about how we can display some books talking about disability and neurodivergencies in our office. Asking thoughtful questions about residents' lives, interests, beliefs, and relationships. Offering up your own story. I think a lot of times I have students in my office and I do talk about what it's like being Jewish in a mainly Christian conservative area, and that makes a space where students can then offer up their own stories in that space as well. Using inclusive language, like using partner or significant other or spouse, and defaulting to holidays. My first year at Utah Tech, my department was hosting a Christmas party 20 days before actually Christmas, and it was actually hosted during Hanukkah. So I go to my boss and I say, hey, I know that myself and some other RAs don't celebrate Christmas. Like, can we call it a holiday party? You would not believe the amount of pushback I got from these folks. But we did end up calling it a holiday party, and it's been a holiday party since. Now, I love Christmas, don't get me wrong. It's an awesome time of year. And I want students who celebrate Christmas to be honored in their traditions, but I also want everybody else to be honored in their traditions. And when it comes to holiday parties, I think maybe that's the best term to use. And then default to they. I was actually doing an online training for the university, our annual compliance trainings. In the video, they kept saying she or he or his or her. And I was just like, ugh. You can just switch it to they. They has been used as a singular pronoun. It's been documented for hundreds of years. So switch to they and default, and that's a good place to start. And then finally, checking in with residents before making assumptions about what makes them feel comfortable in social situations. I always ask my RAs at the beginning of the year, I'm like, how do you like to receive feedback? What is your preferred method? Is it direct? Is it indirect? Is it through an email? Through a text? And then how would you like to be celebrated? Some people like to be celebrated in front of an entire group. Some people just want to receive a note in their mailbox or in your one-to-one in your office. So asking them how they would like to be interacted with will make them also feel safe in those social situations and help them downregulate as well. Questions about microaggressions? Yes.
Not a question, but I definitely want to chime into one of your points of like using the correct pronouns. I remember I did a internship in Oregon at OSU, and I was working with this one individual named Sam, and they were amazing. So they had recently changed their pronouns to they, them from he, him. And I remember one day they had came up to me like, Jordan, like, thank you so much for like, using the correct pronouns. And I was like, I mean, like, it's not a challenge for me, but obviously like, for others it could be, and definitely for others, like they won't like, use their pronouns. And it just meant a lot just to hear them say that, and like, just continuing that mission, that work of like making sure others are aware of pronouns and like why it's important and things like that. So.
Absolutely, thank you for sharing. Yeah. Yes.
The other thing that's important is asking people's pronouns, like if they dress androgynous, don't assume that they use they, them, or if you dress feminine or masculine, don't assume people's pronouns based off of how they present, because they also don't always line up with gender identity either. Like I'm a woman who also uses they pronouns in addition to she, and that's okay too. So I've had a couple of friends just like ask my pronouns, and I ask people, and I think it's just like a sign of respect of like, I will call you how you're most comfortable, but just tell me what that is.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, not assuming and asking as well. And I also have met a lot of folks in different transitions. Gender is very fluid, and so I also think that sometimes someone might not want to share their pronouns because they don't necessarily know, and that is also okay. So if you ask them for their pronouns and they're like, actually I'm not really sure, I don't really want to share, like that's also okay. So thank you for bringing that up. Yeah.
Just refer people too.
What'd you say?
So you can just refer people by name.
Absolutely, right? That's a great default, using their name. Perfect, yes.
I'm just kind of referring back to the comment your father made to you about the snowflake generation, and I'm wondering if you have experience with them or your family or father about being able to offer these micro affirmations in a palatable way for him to
Yes, that's a great question.
climb to.
Who often tries to have these conversations with their family members?
Oh.
2 hands for me. Feet also, if I could lift up all 4, I would. That is a great question and something I get very often. I think that what is extremely important is not necessarily the conversation you're having with that specific person, but what others are hearing around you. So I think oftentimes I'm having a conversation maybe at a holiday family get together or in a social space where there are other people maybe eavesdropping in. And I've had situations where I've had cousins listening in, and I'm just talking about my own personal experience with this and how it affects me, and they hear that and then they know that I'm that safe space for them. So I think that we're not going to be able to change everyone's minds, and that's not what this work is about. It's about bettering ourselves to be better for others. So I had a cousin who hadn't come out as queer to the family yet, but was hearing me share my story about being a queer woman, the microaggressions that happened with that to my father, and then came up to me afterward, and they knew that was a safe space for me. So I think we think that the work is being done in those like heated discussions with our family members, but it's often being done in the eavesdropping or what people hear, or indirect ways that people know that you're that safe space for them. Does that answer your question? I know it's hard and it feels like we're running into a brick wall sometimes, but the impact is there whether we feel like we're making quote unquote headway with a certain individual. Yeah. Yes.
Question.
Yeah.
I don't know, like, I'm going to butcher the way I'm going to ask this question, but can you give me some advice or kind of steer me in a direction where I can like kind of like address this concern? But my partner, her brother Jack, great guy if you met him, but man, he says like these weird things related to LGBTQ plus community. And when he says these things, he's also someone who hasn't come up to his family, but also is a part of the community, but like he hasn't like come out to everyone else. It's like certain people know. So like how would you handle, or how would you encourage me to handle a conversation where he's saying perhaps macroaggressions within the community that he somewhat identifies with, but isn't fully like there.
Right. Yeah, that's a tough one, right? I think sometimes we often think that if we're part of that community, we hold that identity, we can't say, it's impossible for us to say a microaggression targeted towards our own community. That's definitely false. For example, in the LGBTQ community, there's a lot of homophobia that exists. There's a lot of, there's a scale of like what is socially okay for the queer community, what it looks like to be out. I think a lot of times people use the word passing in the trans community to say, oh, like you need to pass or it's not okay to be trans. Like you need to look like the gender of the pronouns that you're using, you know what I mean? And passing, we're phasing that out because gender is very fluid, right? But I think there's a lot of painful things that go on within specifically the queer community that are microaggressions towards their own community. So I want to open it up to the group. Does anybody have a response to Jordan's question? Yes.
From some of my reading, I've actually seen it stated as like a defense mechanism or othering someone else to take the heat off of oneself. And so I've heard about that from time to time. And I think a lot of times, and you're probably going to get to this later, but one of the greatest questions is just, what do you mean by that? You know, having those conversations of like letting that person explain what they mean by their comments, by their macro and microaggressions, and then letting them come to the realization that this is actually really harmful, and it could also be harmful to me because I'm othering someone else, and I'm taking that heat off of myself.
Yes. And that is what's called a micro-intervention.
I knew you were going to get to it.
My absolute favorite question is, what do you mean by that? Did that answer your question? Thank you for bringing it up. Yeah. Other thoughts on this slide? Yes.
I feel like if it's a situation where like they say something homophobic in front of someone else and not everybody hear it out or something, like you could say something like, oh hey, that's not okay, or let's be respectful, or like I've used that when people are saying sensitive things, like let's just be positive or let's be respectful here. Just like a general, and then you can just call out that behavior and it doesn't like target them as part of that community either. So if they're doing that because they're feeling insecure, they're having issues with it, then you can just call it out as you see it, I guess.
Absolutely. Y'all are doing my job. We'll switch places. And so yeah, this is a great segue that leads us into micro-interventions. And maybe you got the idea from your packet, and that's okay too. So micro-interventions are small things we can do when either we're observing a microaggression or maybe a student has come to our office and told us about a microaggression that happened. So again, starting in the top left, ask the person, are you okay? I noticed what they said seemed to get to you, / is there anything I can do? Or how would you like me to respond? Say that you find the underlying attitude or behavior to be a problem and state the reason why to the perpetrator. Try to help the perpetrator understand what they did. For example, I'm not sure if you know, but what you said is homophobic because X. If you see an ongoing situation, go and stand / sit with the survivor, the person who's the target, and start up a conversation, effectively putting yourself between them and the perpetrator. You'd be surprised at how much body language can interrupt some of these things. Never join in with jokes that belittle others. Better still, publicly say that you don't like that kind of joke. This is where what do you mean by that comes in, or I don't understand the joke, can you explain it to me? And there's nothing that gets wheels spinning when someone who's telling a racist or sexist joke, they don't get the laughter that they're hoping for, and then they have to explain why they're telling that joke. Give it a shot. My email's at the end. If you give it a shot, email me and tell me how it went and we can talk about it. And then finally, understand and promptly utilize institutional reporting processes and procedures. This is a big one, If a student comes to you and it's a repeated microaggression, maybe that's happening by a coworker to them, or by a professor, or their academic advisor, right? These are things that need to be reported, and you all have reporting systems for this type of behavior. I think that often maybe we're not like, oh, this, maybe isn't that big of a deal or something. That's going back to that microaggression of invalidating and denying someone's experience. Everybody has the right to report on their campuses. Something we often get come room assignments time, and raise your hand if you have a similar experience to this. We get an email on our housing inbox that says, my roommate is gay, I need an immediate switch,
That's a good one.
right? And we email back and we're like, how do you know? You know what I mean? Oh, I've seen their Instagram. Huh? Right? So that's when you send them a little email that says, hello, thank you for reaching out. I would like to refer you to our equity compliance office. And our wonderful director of equity compliance can address your concerns. Right? So knowing who to direct people to, we don't want to give it to people who are emailing us saying their roommates are gay, or our roommates are X, our roommates have a certain skin color, our roommates have a certain religion, or not of a certain religion, right? So that's definitely something to think about as well. How do your university systems work for you? And also notice how they work against you. I think sometimes our students of color, our LGBTQ students, even myself with the anti-Semitic comments, we go through these formal reporting processes, and maybe it's even more invalidating for us depending on what happens. But just knowing what resources are available is extremely helpful to us as educators. Questions or comments on micro interventions? Has anybody used have you used the what do you mean? How did it go?
They just feel stupid.
They just feel
They
stupid.
realize.
Okay.
Sometimes you get an apology, sometimes you get a whatever.
Right, and at least we did the work.
Yep.
At least we did the work. Yes, was that a hand?
Kind of. I mean, it was pretty much the same situation what you addressed earlier, because this year we had a student that had a roommate in a double room, and then they saw a pride flag that was hanging on their wall. So it was an immediate assumption for this student to be like, oh, they're part of this community. And so when they messaged us, they messaged our housing office, they said, same thing, I want to move to an immediate room. And it's like, okay, are you kind of counteract that. Like, are you okay? Like, is there harm or being injured? She's like, I'm at risk. And it's like, we can bring police over if we need to. And they're like, no, it's not that. And so once the roommate came in, she explained her situation, that she was an ally, attended a pride parade because her best friend was wanting to open up and explain who she really, like, she wanted to bring out who she truly is, which is fantastic. And then once she understood that, she's like, oh, and that's where the micro interventions come in. Is where we provide an educational piece with that, because in Montana, it's pretty conservative within that state up there. And so within the first couple of weeks, our RA staff, as well as our hall directors, provide micro intervention learning opportunities for our residents. That's saying that assumption, you don't ever have to assume anything, but you can also have that opportunity to be open and bring in this type of community and just be welcoming, because if you meet somebody, they could be your best friend and you may not even know it. So
I love the piece you pull out, that educational piece, right? Sitting down and having that conversation. And even if the roommate wasn't an ally, but was in fact part of the queer community, that's also okay too.
Yes.
And we still want to do that educational component and that empathy component. So thank you for bringing that up. Other comments or questions on this slide? Yes.
I was just gonna say my favorite statement that you can use like in almost anything, maybe not in a group setting, is tell me more. You don't like dining services, tell me more. You don't like your roommate, tell me more.
Right.
It's not threatening at all. You get a lot of information. I use it all the time on my 16-year-old daughter.
Yeah.
It's just so simple, and you can go really, really far with that simple statement.
Right. And a lot of our residents just want to be heard. I think that's been my motto this year, is I just want our residents to feel heard. And so if I can't necessarily help them with their situation, let's sit down for 30 minutes and just talk about it. And that might make them feel better as well. Thank you. Was that a hand as well? Oh, I thought you, never mind. Okay. All right, so here's just some more tools that you can use. So if you're the one who committed the microaggression, we're not all perfect. Sometimes we step in it, as I call it, and we make mistakes. We aren't perfect. So if you've committed the microaggression and you realize that it's happened, you can say, I'm almost certain I just made a mistake and hurt you. I would really like to hear from your perspective how you feel about what just happened. I put an asterisk in there saying if they feel comfortable. They might want to just leave the situation immediately. They might not want to talk about it. They might want to talk about it tomorrow, or they might never want to talk about it. And that's okay too. But just opening up that space to have that dialogue, if it's something that they want, we should be doing that. And for pronouns, I get a question often, I don't know what to do if I misgender someone. I don't know what to do if I use the incorrect pronouns for someone. Correct yourself and move on. Don't make a habit out of it because someone will notice. Someone notices if you say the wrong pronoun and then use the correct pronoun and you move on, like it's normal. They're gonna appreciate that so much more than if you go, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, so sorry, you know what I mean? So just correct yourself, move on, and be intentional moving forward about not repeating that behavior. Yes?
I just want to add, I've had friends do this where they get so guilty about misgendering someone that they make it the queer person's problem. To the point where like, they're like, oh, I feel so bad, and they're like beating themselves up about it.
Right.
And like, well, like I have queer friends that will say they misgender themselves, like they screw up pronouns sometimes, everyone slips up. But yet, like you said, like, just correct it and move on, because a lot of people I've seen like don't want to move on and make it so bad, and like you're making it worse.
Right.
You just want them to tell you it's totally okay. But it's not okay, you just have to move forward. So.
Absolutely, thank you for that addition. I think that oftentimes we think that maybe since someone uses a certain pronoun with you, they want it to be used in other spaces too. And your comment reminded me of this, of it's important that someone even like comes out to you or says they're non-binary or says they use neo-pronouns or something like that. Ask them, is it okay like when I'm talking with other people about you if I use these pronouns? Or what pronouns would you like me to use if I'm talking to one of your roommates or talking to one of my coworkers? So asking that question also is good. Yeah.
I've been in a new group of friends too where like my cousin started using they them pronouns recently, and they just said, hey, why don't we go around and introduce ourselves with pronouns? And then like, everyone knew how to address each other in that small setting too, what we were comfortable with.
Yeah, awesome, I love that.
And then they were able to introduce them to us.
That's great. Yeah, in the back.
So I have an RA who identifies as male. I have a reference letter for him.
Okay.
It's like, what name would you like on there?
Yes, right. How many of you are writing references, letters of recommendations for your RAs, right? What name would you like me to use? What pronouns would you like me to use in that? That's awesome. Thank you for bringing that up. How do we continue that trajectory for them past being an RA, past being at our institution? That's awesome.